Hi, everyone, and welcome to the second episode of the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Today, we'll be discussing the relevance of Marxism to the global south and the situation of the global south more broadly with Vijay Prashad. Vijay is the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research and the author of over 40 books, including Poorer Nations, A Possible History of the Global South, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World, and Red Star Over the Third World. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. All right, here's my conversation with Vijay Prashad. Okay, thanks, Vijay. Welcome to the International Solidarity Pod. As I was telling you before, I've learned a lot from you, so it's great to have you on. Today we'll be discussing Marxism in the Global South. I wanted to talk about this because, in the West, where I'm based, there tends to be both a kind of Eurocentric and masculine sort of understanding of Marxism among some left tendencies, and then also the sort of opposite tendency among, I would say, non-white folks on the broad left, rejecting or shunning Marxism because, seeing it as this inherently European or white kind of thing. We also see this in some parts of the global south. I know in South Asia, for example, like this line is often repeated that Marxism is a foreign ideology, often by anti-communist forces to discredit it, all of which is, deeply incorrect and misinformed. So let's start here. I have a two-part question. First, how is Marxism relevant as a method of analysis to the conditions of the global south? And I want to emphasize this method of analysis, Marxism as a method of analysis rather than sort of a dogma around the guy, Marx, which is often how it's sort of portrayed to be. So that's the first part. Second part is, how has Marxism been taken up as practice across the global south in national liberation struggles?
I mean, let's reverse the order of the questions because I think that's probably easier for people to grasp what I'm going to say. Um, I mean, look, firstly, almost all the success, in fact, all the successful Marxist revolutions have taken place in the global south, including the October Revolution, the Russian Revolution. I mean, it's true that part of Russia is in Europe, but the vast mass of Russia is in Asia. It's also true that the bulk of Russia's population is in the European part, but the revolution was led by peasants and workers. It was different than what would have happened if the German Revolution had succeeded, or if there had been a British Revolution or a Marxist revolution in North America, because those would have had to perforce be led by mainly workers, the peasantry, a very small percentage of the population. These countries had Marxist revolutions, in many cases with populations that had no idea about Marxism. Even the leading forces, the main people who led these movements, hadn't really been able to spend enough time training as Marxists. They had some political schools here and there, but they were actually following the course of history, which is that if we're going to overthrow colonial rule, let's take the case of Vietnam. If we're going to overthrow colonial rule, what's the point of overthrowing colonial rule and establishing Vietnamese rule that looks like the colonial rule? We want to have a different kind of society, a society where people have choices and can make decisions and so on. And that leads you to socialism. In other words, the actual movement of history, if you take national liberation seriously all the way, not just to the point of expelling the foreign invader, if you take it all the way, everybody should benefit in the territory, you're going to lead to socialism. So many of these countries had effectively Marxist type revolutions without Marxism being, the principal leading ideology in their movements, let alone in their countries. Yeah. So you can talk about the Soviet Union, Vietnam, 1945, China, 1949, Cuba, 1959, and so on. These are all countries of the global south. I mean, people who say Marxism is not relevant to the global south, well, it's pretty relevant to what had been there in the Soviet Union for 70 years, Vietnam, China, Cuba still, right? It's pretty relevant in these places, my friends. China has 1.4 billion people. It's led by a communist party. Don't talk to me about the relevance or non-relevance of Marxism. It's relevant to them. People say this very silly way. Well, let's listen to the Chinese. Well, okay, let's listen to the Chinese then. They seem to be pretty okay with their system, which is not a communist system. Yeah, it's not called a Communist Republic of China. It's called the People's Republic of China. It's led by the Communist Party. It's not a communist system by any means. Yeah, it's a People's Republic. They want to put the agenda of the people ahead of, let's say, capital or whatever. Okay, so that's the second question, second part of your question. Let's go back to the first part. I mean, the last time I checked, the global south was part of the world. And as far as we know, the dominant system in the world, economic system, is capitalism. The dominant system. There are no real enclaves away from capitalism. As I said, China is not a communist country. It's led by the Communist Party, but they have to engage with capitalism. That's part of them being in the world. They don't live on their own island. Yeah. So if the world has a dominant system, which is capitalism, the most adequate critique of capitalism was written by Karl Marx. I mean, Marx identified the basic structures of capitalism, which are largely unchanged. How surplus value is extracted, the way in which labor is commodified, the double nature of the commodity, all of those structural features of capitalism, which Marx identified, will remain as long as capitalism remains. Now, of course, you're going to know that capitalism is not the same as it was in 1867. There's more, let's say, immaterial goods and so on, services, but these are not also things that are alien to the 19th century. There were immaterial services in the 19th century. Things change, of course. The internet wasn't there, blah, blah, blah. You can modify, you can develop, you can deepen. All of that is true. But the essential structural features of capitalism, which Marx critiqued in 1867 and then in other writings of his, that remains intact. So as a method, as long as capitalism exists, Marxism has to exist. There is no better, no superseded better method of understanding capitalism from a critical standpoint than Marxism. I mean, in a way, my teacher Ejaz Ahmed used to say directly, all post-Marxisms are actually pre-Marxist because they kind of detour back to forms of idealism and so on. We don't need to get too much into that in detail, but it is also true that Marxism isn't static. It continues to grow and develop, and it continues to be an adequate critique of capitalism. Listen, if you give me a better critique of capitalism, I'll accept it. I just haven't seen it.
That's right. That's spot on. So we're reaching a year and a half of the genocide in Palestine. Palestinians in Gaza still find themselves without shelter, food, essential supplies. Recently, several babies have died due to hypothermia because of how cold it is, lack of shelter, etc. Israel has also recently halted all aid into the Gaza Strip and is trying to strong arm the Palestinian resistance into changing the terms of the ceasefire agreement. Israel's also increased its attention toward the West Bank, targeting, Jenin and Tulkarm refugee camps, attempting to eliminate pockets of resistance there, but obviously at the same time eliminating all sort of basis for life there. My question is, how is a Marxist understanding of imperialism useful for us to understand the situation in Palestine? We'll come to hyper-imperialism, but for those who might not have, heard, of the sort of Marxist understanding of imperialism, what is it and how does it explain what's happening in Palestine and what Israel represents to the West?
I mean, it's a couple of things. It's a very well formulated question. There's a couple of things to put on the table. Okay, the first thing I would put on the table is that it is axiomatic. Okay, it's absolutely comes out of the category of imperialism that nobody should defy those who control the world system. those who authorize history. Okay, so if the United States, the old colonial powers, the British, the French, and so on, authorize history, they are the authors of history. It is axiomatic for them to say that others must not have sovereignty. Now, you can have what Frantz Fanon called flag independence for many countries. Yeah, it's 193 countries in the United Nations. Palestine is one of the few where their ability to have flag independence is constrained. Yeah, the flags that fly in Ramallah in the West Bank of the occupied Palestinian territory don't really count because it's a kind of half sovereignty. It's not really sovereignty. So you can have in many parts of the world sovereignty is okay. You can have sovereignty, but defiance is not permitted. So, for instance, if a Thomas Sankara comes on the scene in at the time Upper Volta, changes the name of his country to Burkina Faso, land of upright people, and says that, look, we want to define our own history. We don't want to import food. We want to grow our own food. And he goes to the UN and he talks a big game. He says that this is not the way to organize the world. He's assassinated and his government is overthrown. 10 years before him, Salvador Allende from Chile, where I'm talking to you, also goes to the United Nations. He backs the call for a new international economic order in 1972 at the UN. And the next year, he's overthrown and he dies, in the coup in 1973. Defiance is simply not allowed. The United States is bent out of shape by the defiance of Cuba. Tiny country, 11 million people. Come on. Smaller than the population of New York City. Relax, United States. I mean, you've got all this territory. You control half the world. Relax. Let the Cubans be the little asterisks and obelisks in their little village, at the corner of Gaul. Why are you so bent out of shape? But remember, in the comic Asterix and Obelix, Caesar is obsessed with overthrowing this little Gaulish village that is defying the Roman Empire at the edge of Gaul. Yeah. Defiance is just not permitted for imperialism. That's the first thing. Secondly, the West has really done something cruel to the world. It has a history, a deep and ugly history of anti-Semitism. Europe is the originator of anti-Semitism, grotesque history of pogroms, discrimination against Jews, the whole idea that Jews killed Christ and so on, this deep antipathy to Jews. It basically is saturated the soil of Europe. And this leads in a way to the Holocaust. And so rather than deal with their own problems, rather than look in the mirror and deal with the Holocaust, rather than say, look, we're going to have to make right and create societies without anti-Semitism, they said to Jewish populations, why don't you just go and settle in the Levantine region where they had already started this after the Balfour Declaration of 1916, they exported their problem to the global South. And in a sense, having exported the problem after 1945, little guilt at the Holocaust and the pogroms, they basically treated Israel as a colony of Europe inside Asia, surrounded by Arabs. And, this is the reason why Israel, for instance, is in Eurovision. It doesn't exist in Europe. Why do they contribute to Eurovision? Or why Israel plays in the European Football League? Why is it playing? It should play in the Asian Games. Why is it playing in the European Football League? It's not a European country, but they see it as that. So not only the defiance of the Palestinians had to be punished and punished, periodically, but also this little colony of Europe had to be defended. I mean, in a way, it's the opposite of Cuba. Cuba is this little country of 11 million, which has to have a government that must be overthrown. And Israel, the opposite country, a very small country of people, which is apartheid state. Cuba is not an apartheid state. Cuba is a state where everybody's equal. In fact, the Cuban government has been struggling with racism and recent decades, homophobia, and they have one of the most liberal, actually I use the word liberal deliberately, family laws in the world, which was passed by a referendum. Israel is the opposite. They have an apartheid state, second-class citizens for Arabs and so on. The West is driven in a crazy way to defend that outpost, whereas they want to overthrow this one, It's an interesting comparison. So that's the second thing. First is the defiance. Second is this race angle that, having planted this European seed in Asia, they want to protect it. But then there's a third one, which is that it is also true that there's a lot to be gained by Israel being the kind of aircraft carrier of the West to discipline defined countries in the Middle East. Israel is the weapon to basically punish Iran. Anytime a national liberation type government or a republic emerged, Israel was utilized by the West, and actually Israel utilized the West at the same time to help strengthen their hand there. Whether it's against the Assad government or it was to effectively prevent the rising of left-wing forces in the Arabian Peninsula, when there was a Marxist government in Yemen, the snuffing out of that. Israel provided the Saudis with support for all of that, intelligence support, and so on. So, I mean, this is imperialism. If somebody asks me what's imperialism, imperialism effectively is using extra economic power to maintain control of the world. And if anybody defies you, whacking them. It's a little mafia-like, imperialism is. And this genocide has been totally a mafia-type genocide.
That's right. So, I mean, you sort of started to touch on this. Since the 1960s, much of the global South had gained independence from colonialism, nominal independence. Still today, though, we can see that, much of the global South is not free in any meaningful sense of the term. And this is much of the world's population living undignified lives, essentially. How can we understand the challenges faced by the global South today? Is neocolonialism a helpful way to think about this? Your thoughts on that?
I mean, neocolonialism is an interesting concept. It was probably most widely known in the global South through Kwame Nkrumah's 1965 book, Neocolonialism, which was I think the only book that was reviewed by the CIA. In the CIA files, there's a review of the book, and in fact, many people say that it's that book that was the final straw and brought the coup on Nkrumah the following year. Neocolonialism is an interesting concept because it basically says that after the colonial power withdraws and leaves flag independence in place in a country, let's say like Ghana, Ghana, because it doesn't have the capital to industrialize, diversify its economy, continues to sell primary products, cocoa, gold, and so on, to the West, who then industrially processes all these products and sells it back as finished goods. That's really neocolonialism. That's the essence of Nkrumah's thing, is that, we don't have capital. You stole all the capital during the period of imperialism. We can't develop. Actually, we don't live in that period anymore. That doesn't describe the present. And the reason it doesn't describe the present is with the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States made an interesting bet. And international capital followed this bet. And this is the concept of globalization. Very interesting bet that the US made. The US basically ensured that intellectual property rules were rewritten into the World Trade Organization. So that, previously, if you had a pen, the pen itself couldn't be patented, like the final pen product. Anybody could make this pen. What was patented was the process. It was process-based patenting. So that, if I could find a different way to make the same pen as you do, I can make it. Of course, with a pen, this is a trivial example, but with pharmaceuticals, it's fundamental. If I'm able to develop a pill for malaria with a different process, if I can reverse engineer the pill and discover what's in it, and I make it, I don't have to pay royalties to the pharmaceutical companies, those companies. But in the fall of the Soviet Union, the US revised this and made it not processed patenting, but product patenting. This is important. Having done that, the US then says, okay, we're going to just deindustrialize. It's too expensive to make things in the United States, in Germany. The labor is too expensive. We're going to deindustrialize. And we're going to allow factories to be built. Foreign direct investment is a new term. We're going to allow factories to be built in Malaysia, India, China, wherever. And these countries have to basically open the door, give us access to their workforce. After the Soviet Union collapses, all this Eastern European labor. And so industry shifts its geographical location into the South. So these countries no longer are just exporting raw materials. They are, in fact, exporting finished goods. But because of the change in intellectual property laws, multinational companies claimed enormous rents on the goods. In fact, what's interesting is it's in this period that, like, Nike stops manufacturing shoes. Subcontractors manufacture the shoes. Nike just collects rents on it. Apple doesn't make Apple phones. Foxconn made the phones in China, and Apple collected rent off the phones. That was the trick of globalization. These companies became research and development, patenting outfits, huge legal departments, and then rent collecting. Yeah. And if anybody copyright violation, they would go after you in a big way. That's how they made their money. Well, China started booming on this model. And then the Chinese turned to businesses that wanted to enter China and said, okay, you want to use our labor, you build, solar panels. Okay, you can come in and build a factory in, Wuhan or in Shenzhen or wherever, but we want you to tell us how you do it. Show us the patents. We want to have a look at the science and the technology. And so companies so eager now for hardworking Chinese labor and, cheaper than in the West, said, okay, here's the patent. Have a look, And Chinese engineers looked at it and said, this is interesting. Okay, we can actually make a better solar panel. We just need to do this, that, and the other. And so then they built a solar panel company. And now China is the major exporter of solar panels. Some of these companies took China to the World Trade Organization saying patent infringement, copyright infringement. The Chinese said, really? No, wait a minute. You signed this contract that allowed us to look at your patent and to take notes and whatever. We studied it and then we made it better. We didn't do process-based changes. We actually made the whole thing better. Even the product is better. Yeah, it's cheaper to make and so on. Huawei makes better smartphones, Honor better smartphones, and way cheaper than Apple, because Huawei and Honor and even Korea's Samsung don't take out this enormous rent that Apple does for advertising, for design, for the Apple boxes that you get stuff in and whatnot. Yeah. And also Huawei then develops new and better things, like the Idea board from Huawei is way better. It's a smart computer, which is like a whiteboard. You can write on it, you can print from it and so on. Way better than anything that Apple has made in a long time. So this has changed the world situation, and primarily because of the economic advances taking place and the shift in economic geography. The West has come to the realization, wait a minute, we can't compete with these people. This is not neocolonialism. We can't compete. They're out competing us. So what we're going to do is we're going to smash them. We're going to either ban them from selling their goods in our countries. We're going to threaten them with military force. We're going to, tell stories about how they are genocidal and whatever. And in our institute, this line of inquiry led us to make the argument that this is not neocolonialism anymore. This is hyper-imperialism. In other words, it's a kind of hyperactive, mentality of like, hey, wait a minute, you're defying us economically, not permitted. Get back in line. You're Chinese. You can't be making better phones. Get back in line. Go back. Find your place. This is part of hyper-imperialism. And you know what? If you don't get back in line, we're going to humiliate you. We're going to call you genocidal. We're going to say in Xinjiang, you're doing a genocide. We're going to say you're doing this, you're doing that. I mean, Xinjiang, you're doing a genocide. Hey guys, flash news to the United States audience. The US government went into Iraq and destroyed that country. And, maybe over 1 million people died, threw people into prisons, tortured them, threw them into black sites, tortured them. Okay, you don't like what the Chinese are doing. They're putting people into camps, telling them that, the Quran can be interpreted this way and not that way. Last I checked, nobody's alleging that the Chinese are killing 1 million people in Xinjiang. Yeah, it's weird. This whole thing about the genocide in of the Uyghurs is very strange, but that's hyper-imperialism. Just come out there and say, these guys are awful. I mean, even Russia. I mean, how much worse is the situation in Russia under Putin, than the situation in any of these countries? Yeah, let's take Hungary or Poland or whatever. How much worse is it than Saudi Arabia, ruled by a absolute monarch? They say, oh, it's a dictator in Russia. It's an absolute monarch who's your best friend in Saudi Arabia. For God's sake, I mean, okay, you want to call somebody a dictator, that's fine, but this guy's an absolute monarch. What are you, on? So hyper-imperialism, which is going to whack you. It's this attitude there. Neocolonialism relied on the idea that, okay, we're going to take your raw materials, sell you goods. The terms of trade are against you. You'll be in debt forever. But now these countries are industrializing. And they are saying interesting things. The Chinese are saying, we're going to industrialize Africa. Nobody has said that to the Africans in generations. We're going to industrialize. Why? Because the Chinese say we're carrying too many surpluses. There's too much. We don't want the surplus. It's too much of a headache. We want you to build factories so that the terms of trade are not so adverse against you. We are generating way too many surpluses. It's very interesting. It's a different world.
We're coming to China. And you already started, touching on hyper-imperialism. That was my next question. I mean, just to introduce it, your institute, the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, has released a dossier titled Hyper-Imperialism, A Dangerous, Decadent New Stage. I wanted to sort of put that subtitle there to sort of flesh things out a little bit more and then hand it to you to tell us a little bit more about hyper-imperialism, if you have things to say on that, and also how the Global South finds itself in this stage of hyper-imperialism. I've heard you use the term, the new mood in the South. So just a couple of things there on the table. Take it away.
Well, look, I mean, frankly, part of the work of an institute such as Tricontinental is to try to have as close a measure of reality as possible. Obviously, we are driven by certain political objectives. We have our ideas, we have our methodologies, and so on. No point having a method, no point believing in a goal of equality and all that if you don't have an accurate understanding of the world, because how are you going to change the world if you have a fantasy idea? Yeah, so we are very much data driven. We look at the data, we study actual military spending. I mean, all of that stuff is in this document. We wanted to capture as closely as we understand it how the West behaves in the world. Well, years ago, Samir Amin put forward the view, the Egyptian Marxist, that, there are 5 areas of control in the world: control over raw materials, control over, technology and science, control over communications, control over the military. These controls are very significant. Well, in the main economic ones, the West no longer controls them. It no longer controls raw materials. I mean, the popular coup governments in Niger, Burkina Faso, they want to control the materials. Even in the center-left governments in Sri Lanka and in Senegal, the governments want to control their raw materials. They don't want the West to control them. Yeah, I mean, this issue about what Trump kept calling the raw earth materials, but are really the rare earth materials in Ukraine. It's about control over raw materials. People don't want to give up their sovereignty any longer. That is over. Even the issue of science and tech, I mean, it's an open field now. The West doesn't control it. Yeah, the Chinese are building better high-speed rail. Indians are developing new kinds of tech, which are just not, being developed in the West. Okay, fine. The 2 areas where there hasn't been any real shift in global North power. One is in communications, the other is military. There is no doubt that the military force of the West is much greater than anybody. That doesn't mean that it can prevail. It just means that it can destroy things. The Iranians are afraid that if the US starts to come and bomb Iran, it would be a catastrophe for Iran. Yeah. But hey, that's not the same as being able to go and conquer Iran and rule it with a viceroy. They discovered that in Iraq, but they can destroy Iraq. They bomb Baghdad, horrendous bombing of Baghdad. So anyway, So military force, let's give it to the West. Communications as well, the global North dominates. I mean, we're doing, this conversation. I mean, we're going to get a minuscule number of listeners compared to, say, I don't know, Fox News or BBC, minuscule. I mean, it pains me to say it, but it's a reality. Yeah. So they are ahead in those things. So in that sense, they use the tools they have. And so hyper-imperialism basically demonstrates the tools they have. And we really focused on the military in this text, not in communications as much. That's a little bit of a lacking thing in the text. We focus way more on the military. They have the ability to smash any country. We show how. And we show the power of the base strategies and so on. The new technologies of warfare. We show that China and Russia are largely defensive powers. They're not actually offensive powers. They can't come and win wars against the US, against the global North. They can defend themselves. They are, in fact, seeing the invasion of Ukraine as a defensive war. I don't agree that it's defensive entirely. They invaded Ukraine, but I can understand how it is defensive at the same time. Yeah. So let's go to the subtitle of the report, Dangerous and Decadent, because there are no economic tools. Yeah, there are no economic, social tools that the global North has to reassert its power. It opens the holster, reaches for the gun. That's the best thing to do, and so that makes it dangerous. It is a dangerous force. Yeah, chillingly dangerous. I mean, Pete Hegseth, the Defense Secretary of the United States, when he says we're going to cut military spending, he says we're going to cut military spending in order to make the military more lethal. It's important we listen to the whole sentence. To make the military more lethal. So we're going to cut some of the standing army, and we're going to put the money into the Iron Dome. We're going to put the money into the counter-force strategy. You know what counter-force is? Incredible. The US government. Counter-force strategy. Previously, there was a big move in the nuclear war prevention movement for no first strike. Countries with nuclear weapons were asked, would you do a first strike? And they were supposed to sign a pledge, no first strike. I'm never going to be the first to fire a nuclear weapon. The United States is long past that. In fact, from the time of Ronald Reagan's Star Wars, they basically set aside the no first strike. Because what was Star Wars? Star Wars said, let's say you are my nuclear adversary, and I built a Star Wars shield, yeah, or an Iron Dome, which was one of the executive orders Trump signed. People didn't pay attention to that. They looked at the other things, which were distracting. The Iron Dome one was very significant because both Star Wars and Iron Dome, what did they say? If we succeed in being able to block a first nuclear attack, then effectively my strike is a first strike. That's a counter-force strategy. Yeah, nobody can get to me because I have an Iron Dome. So in fact, I am committing to a first strike, because I can protect myself from any missile attack. And that the US has openly written about what they call counter-force, which is effectively a no first strike maneuver. This is dangerous. And the second word is decadent. Why decadent? Well, because these leaders in the West have no ideas. What's the German election? What was the debate about? What were they talking about the fact that IG Metall was losing, its standing in the stock market, or even more interesting, the inflation levels super high in these countries, in the West. What's you're going to raise military spending to 3.5% of GDP? Are you going to fund everything else in your society? It's a big waste. Marx said that military spending is like throwing your wealth, your treasure into the ocean. It's total waste. A whole bogus idea of military Keynesianism that, if you spend on the military, it boosts the economy. That's true, but also not true. Because it depends on what the military spending is. Gone are the days when the military built large railways, freeway systems and so on. Now they are just buying high-tech goods to destroy the enemy, including robots and so on. I mean, I've been in a position to see these military robots, and it's scary. This is warfare which actually can be very detrimental to an enemy that can't defend itself from such fighting units. How do you kill a robot coming right at you super fast? So anyway, the point is that that's the decadence. I mean, they are willing to put 3.5% of their GDP in a war footing, but they're not willing to put it to help homelessness or whatever it is. That's the decadence of their worldview. So they're dangerous people who are decadent. Man, it's a lethal combination.
That's right. Okay, coming to China. It's hard not to think about the rise of China when we think about the global South. So another two-part question, and you might have touched on this a little bit. Let's hear some more. What does China's rise as a global South country mean within the imperialist world system? And second part, what does it mean for the rest of the global South? And you know what? I might tack on another thing there. As you know, I'm Indian. I grew up in Hong Kong, though, so I'm always sort of comparing India and China.
Hmm.
How do you see the two countries as societal projects comparing side by side? I really think this is not something that gets enough attention, and so yeah, two of those things there.
I mean, I'm going to start with your last question again. Sorry to do this to you. And I'm going to start by saying that, I'm a pretty patriotic Indian, okay? I always support the Indian cricket team. And I mean, I love India, I really do. I have a great love and joy for the country where I was born and brought up and so on. But I also know that I grew up in Calcutta. I was born in 1967, 20 years after independence, grew up in Calcutta, wretchedly poor city, lots of poor people in slums suffering from preventable diseases, no running water, etc., etc. Yeah. China had a revolution in 1949, made terrible mistakes, Great Leap Forward. Cultural Revolution was a terrible mistake, I think. It went too far. I mean, the Great Leap Forward, you can't really industrialize like that. You have to have a different kind of plan and a procedure and so on. But nonetheless, China had a revolution led by the Communist Party in 1949, 2 years after India's independence in 47. Okay, it's taken time, but during the pandemic, China abolished extreme poverty. They abolished it. Took a long time. It's over 1 billion people, There's a lot of things to do in a poor country. China had a civil war and a war that lasted from 1937 to effectively 1949. That's a longer World War II than Europe faced. Europe was from 1939 to 45. This is from 37 to 39, Marco Polo incident till the victory of the Communist Party. It's a very long period of turbulence. And yet, the Chinese put resources for literacy and so on, right, immediately, to improve the diet of people. They were focused on that, literacy, diet, housing, that kind of stuff. And so now there's no poverty in China. And in India, there is. And that, to me, is an enormous measure of your third question, which I answered first. That when you look at these two countries in comparison, it's not the growth rates today that should be so interesting to you, who's growing at a faster rate. It's what the Chinese did for their people, for themselves as people. The extent of the liberation, and the resources put into this, it's astounding. Yeah. So that's that. What does China's rise mean in general for the, let's say, imperialist core? I mean, they didn't mind China as long as China was the factory of the world, and mainly the factory for US and European companies. Nobody minded. They cheered China on. Yeah. In fact, we have now reports through the USAID debate of, the USAID funneling money to so-called democracy groups in China and so on. I mean, what's a democracy? There are no homeless people sleeping on the street in Shanghai. In Santiago, there are homeless people. I just walked past a man washing his clothes in a public fountain. Yeah, it's extremely sad. It's denigrating and degrading to people. So what does one do with with changing, with the global South looking at China and saying, can we learn something? Can we digest something? The can we learn something question is interesting because what do they want to learn? Um, Everybody thinks you can just learn by borrowing the high tech and just technologize your society and you're done. In fact, that's not the lesson of the Chinese Revolution, which has been going on. The lesson isn't that. The lesson isn't how do you build a high-speed rail? Yeah, because that is a technical thing. The lesson is that this country, China, has been able through the Communist Party to put the necessary resource in place for institutes that are going to go out there and build the new worlds. So instead of thinking that China's experience is China itself, teaching the world about technology, giving the world money, it's to figure out that within China, this was a massive project, very well thought out of education and of planning, very well thought out. In India, the Planning Commission was suspended by Mr. Modi. We have now something called Niti Aayog. They don't really do planning anymore. And then, quite shamefully, the Indian government, basically has allowed the private sector to lead the tech area. And this means that a lot of small companies are coming up in tech. But there is no public institution, that produces, say, internet goods at a subsidized price. All of that is not visible anymore. And that's actually the pity.
So other than that, when I think of some of the more interesting and promising developments in the global South, I think of the Alliance of Sahel States. You sort of mentioned that a little earlier, which is a new confederation between Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger in the Sahel region of Africa. Um, Tell us a little bit more about about the project that's being built there and what it means for Africa, what it means for the global South.
I mean, this is a really interesting, but it's too long a story to explain everything. Just to put it into a very compressed version, after the Soviet Union collapsed in these countries, they had inherited enormous debts. There was the third world debt crisis, all of that. They went to the Clinton administration, Ibrahim Traore, at the time, the president of Mali went to see the U.S. government, said, "Look, we want a major haircut on our loan. Then we'll have enough resources to settle some of the problems with the Amazigh people in the north. We have some issues with the people in the center of the country. We want to settle these problems, But for that, we desperately need, some debt relief." And the Clinton administration said no such thing. Anthony Lake was the head of the Africa department. No such thing. Sorry, go ahead and keep paying us back. So these countries went into paralysis. That was an opening. If the U.S. government had allowed them to have a major haircut on their debts, it would have been a democratic opening. But no, they were not allowed. And as the debt crisis continued, the political parties in these regions had no agenda because the one thing they were provided, had put on the table was shut down. So they basically became kleptocracies and, they were corrupt and did nothing for years, the main political parties. So when eventually NATO goes and destroys Libya in 2011, 20 years later, and the Al-Qaeda groups come in and start harassing Mali and Niger and to some extent Burkina as well. When Mali 1/3 to half the country was taken over by some of these Islamist groups and so on. When that happened, these countries' leaders called the French in and said, "Please help us." So the French came in for Operation Barkhane, built bases. United States built a giant drone base in Agadez in Niger and so on. And at this point, then having done that, they were not able to really push the Al-Qaeda forces out. And so accusations began to fly that maybe in these countries, Al-Qaeda is working with the French, and there was a great hatred for the French. So in Mali, in Burkina Faso, later in Niger, mass demonstrations took place. Trade unions, the left, women's organizations, mass demonstrations would gather in front of the military bases and government house saying, "Get them out." Government was paralyzed And this is where the low-level officers of the military move. Ibrahim Traore in Burkina Faso moves, and they overthrow these very unpopular governments. These are popular coups. People seem to support them universally, except the elites in these societies. And they've been governing under pressure from, say, ECOWAS, the economic, union of West African states, which threatened to invade these countries. The countries tightened their bonds. They created the Alliance of Sahel States. They're going to create a common military framework and so on. But they're basically, communicating with each other. They want to build a road system, and they're inspiring people everywhere. When Ibrahim Traore came for John Mahama's inauguration in Ghana, when John Mahama won the presidency, Traore was the only one to receive a standing ovation when he went up there to congratulate Mahama. People didn't even recognize the others. And by the way, Ibrahim Traore came armed, and the Western press focused on that, said, how was he allowed to come armed? Well, he was.
That's right. Okay, Vijay, I think we'll leave it at that for today. Thank you very much again for your time. Before we let you go, will you let the audience know how they can stay in touch with your work?
Well, I'd like them to sign up for the Tricontinental materials at thetricontinental.org. A bit of a mouthful of a website, thetricontinental.org. And also, you can follow me on Twitter. I have some fun there. Today, I posted a quote from Krishna Menon, which actually came from a big, thick British intelligence file in which Krishna Menon says, democratic imperialism as a term makes as much sense as a vegetarian tiger. That was a speech that V.K. Krishna Menon gave in 1940 in London. Democratic imperialism makes as much sense as a vegetarian tiger. Krishna Menon then becomes the first head of the embassy in London. And, my grandfather and others worked with him in that embassy, and he was a, vicious critic of imperialism. So, follow me on Twitter. You get tidbits from all the archives that I have sitting around.
That was our conversation with Vijay Prashad. I've left links in the description to the Tricontinental Institute as well as the dossier on hyper-imperialism. And once again, you can follow us on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. Otherwise, reach out to us to let us know your thoughts and feedback. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.